Do you find yourself obsessing over your computer's thermal performance and temperatures? So do I. So today we're going to be testing out the Thermalright Extreme Odyssey thermal pads, as well as the Thermalright TFX thermal paste. So the first thing we're going to have to do is tear this thing down, drain the loop, take out all the acrylic tubing, remove the monoblock, and remove the GPU. So I'm going to do that. We're going to get through that really quick so that we can focus on performance and temperatures. Alright, so this is the Thermalright TFX thermal paste. We're going to apply that and see how that looks. Some paste is a little harder to apply than others, and it seems the higher performance pastes are a little thicker. So we'll put a little bit on there, just a piece of rice size, and we will try to spread that around. I do like the spreaders. It just ensures that you get a nice consistent coverage over your CPU heat spreader. Now this, oh my, I might need to get a little bit of a heat gun to warm up this compound because it is like bubble gum. It does not want to spread very nicely. It is very much a bubble gum compound. So I'm going to get a heat gun just on a low setting, and we're going to just warm that up a little bit so that it's easier to spread. Alright, it took some doing, but the Thermalright TFX compound is kind of like bubblegum. It spreads a lot easier with a heat gun, but getting consistent coverage is kind of hard. Thermalright recommends creating a single bead right along the edge and then spreading it out towards the other edge. I tried a couple different methods, but yeah, it's really hard to spread. So the higher end thermal compounds typically do have a habit of being a little harder to spread because they are a thicker compound, but the heat gun did kind of make it a little more malleable so I could spread it around a little more equally. You want to make sure you've got good coverage. I like to ensure the whole heat spreader has thermal compound on it so that you can really maximize the surface area touching the block so that you get the most cooling possible. So now that we've got that applied, we'll get the block reinstalled, put the motherboard back in the system, and then we'll tear the graphics card apart and get the Thermalright Odyssey pads installed as well. right, so we're gonna try applying this the Thermalright method. So they basically said to put a bead all the way along just one edge and then try to spread that. We might use the heat gun again. We'll have to see how well this spreads this time. But it is very much the consistency of bubble gum. And the way that it spreads, you do need quite a bit. So a 2-gram container, so far enough to use for the GPU and the CPU. So we'll try to spread this as they recommend. So kind of one bead on one side. We'll just kind of get zoomed in there just a little bit more so we can see how Thermalright recommends installing this. So Thermalright recommends installing this by putting a bead and then spreading it kind of uniformly. But it is very much like bubble gum, so it's very hard to get a consistent spread. Their method seems to work a little bit better than to do it the other way. But again, the goal is you want to get that spread consistently across the whole die. And you can see it kind of picks it up as you go. So it's really hard to get this to consistently apply. Because the GPU die is so much smaller with lighter edges, this is going to be even harder to do than on the CPU. Basically what I'm trying to do is just get a consistent layer all the way across the die. But that's very, very challenging with this Thermalright compound. It just does not lend itself well to being spread. I think I'm going to pull the heat gun out and try doing that again. Just because you want such a thin layer, but you want it to be nice and consistent so that you're getting the coverage that you need. So I'm going to heat the die to 150 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 65 degrees Celsius, more than enough temperature for this die to be able to sustain, just so that I can get the compound to spread a little bit easier, because it does not spread well on its own. It just makes way too inconsistent. So we'll heat the compound up to about 65 Celsius or 150 Fahrenheit, and try to get that to cooperate a little bit more so that we can get an equal spread across the whole of the GPU die. So after a lot of hard work tearing down the system, getting it slapped back together again, replacing all the thermal pads on the GPU with the Thermalright Odyssey, and after replacing the thermal compound on the CPU and GPU with the Thermalright TFX compound, we're finally ready to look at some numbers. So I actually was really surprised when I loaded up the benchmarking. I saw some pretty crazy numbers. You know, I've already been using the RTX MX4 compound, which is really good compound. It's very affordable, cost effective, really easy to work with. So booting up the computer and running some benchmarks, running Cinebench R23, I noticed quite a significant temperature difference. While running the multi-core test, the 5950X was hitting 65 degrees Celsius, and after installing the Thermalright compound, the CPU was only running at 56 degrees. So we had about a 9-degree temperature difference between the MX4 and the Thermalright TFX. I wasn't expecting that big of a temperature difference between the MX4 and the Thermalright. I was expecting to get a little bit of diminishing returns, but to see a 9-degree temperature difference while running the same test with the coolant temperature at the same temperature in both tests, I was pleasantly surprised. To drop 9 degrees Celsius is pretty significant. So while running TimeSpy, the MX4 compound was operating at about 60 degrees Celsius as a peak temperature. And while gaming between 55 and 60 degrees Celsius was pretty normal on the MX4. On the Thermalright XFX, I was seeing a max temperature of 44 degrees Celsius. So that's pretty substantial. That's a 16 degree temperature difference between the MX4 and the Thermalright XFX. Now on the block side, I was still using the EK thermal pads, and I swapped out the -8 pads on the back plate as well as the EK pads on the block itself with the Thermalright Odyssey pads. The hotspot temperature on the GPU is still hitting about 80 degrees Celsius with the EK pads. Now that I've gotten rid of all the EK pads and all the major components on the GPU, we're now seeing a maximum hotspot temperature of 56 degrees Celsius. And now the memory is only hitting a maximum of 62 degrees Celsius, whereas before it was hitting about 74 degrees Celsius. So overall, the Thermalright Odyssey thermal pads perform absolutely fantastic. They perform even better than the Thermal Grizzly -8 pads. And they absolutely decimate the stock pads that EK includes with their water block kits. The Thermalright XFX compound gives you a really big boost compared to the MX4 compound. The Thermalright XFX compound is really hard to apply. It's kind of bubblegummy. The compound likes to stick to itself and it doesn't like to adhere to the CPU or to the GPU, so it's really hard to spread. Even using a heat gun and heating things up to about 65 degrees Celsius, it was still fairly difficult to spread, although a lot easier with a heat gun. The reality is most of the high-end compounds require a little bit of extra work to properly apply. So with the CPU, we saw a 9 degree temperature difference. With the GPU, we saw a 16 degree temperature difference. So, mission accomplished. I managed to lower the temperatures even further using Thermalright's products than I had previously using the EK thermal pads and the MX4 compound from Arctic. Now, what are my next steps? Well, now that I've got the system right where I want it, with the temperatures kind of at the peak of cooling efficiency, the next video I'm going to do will be to see how far we can get this system overclocked. So the Thermalright Odyssey thermal pads and the Thermalright TFX compound perform extremely well. You know, there are even better thermal compounds and thermal pads available on the market. Fuji Poly has some excellent thermal pads, and Thermal Grizzly has some very excellent thermal compounds. But Thermalright is priced a little bit higher than MX4, a little bit less than Thermal Grizzly, and to be honest, the performance is extremely good. So if your usual go-to thermal compound is Arctic MX4, you may want to consider moving to the Thermalright XFX. Now, it is a lot harder to work with, so if you want something easier to work with, stick with MX4. It still cools more than sufficiently for any build. But if you're looking at getting every last little ounce of performance out of your water cooling system, a compound like Thermalright's TFX may be right for you. And if you're going to be cooling using a water block on your GPU or on your CPU, and thermal pads are included in those kits, you definitely want to consider swapping out some of those stock thermal pads with something a little bit better. So the Thermalright Odyssey pads and the Thermalright TFX compound get the thumbs up from me. Now I'm ready to move on to overclocking and see just how far I can push this system. Now I've done some overclocking with the MX4 compounds, and when I first moved over to the EK water block using the EK thermal pads, but now that I've got it kind of fine-tuned, I'm ready to take it to the next level. So stay tuned for my next videos where I'll be overclocking the 5950X, showing the different methods of overclocking and giving some pointers on how to get the most performance out of your CPU. And I'll also get into overclocking the RTX 3090 and see just how far I can push that as well. That's it for this video. Thanks for watching, and we'll catch you in the next one.